Hello, my name is Benjamin Webster, and this is a paleolimnological reconstruction of nutrient transport throughout the reservoirs of the Chattahoochee River through time. My co-authors, Dr. Matthew Waters and Dr. Stephen Gulliday. So right off the bat, let's talk about reservoirs. Reservoirs have been a big topic of interest for a long time now, and this is because of their prevalence throughout the globe. In the 1950s, we actually had our first large reservoir boom in terms of construction, and this was coming out of the Great Depression. We were creating more jobs. And we are actually in a second global boom right now. In Southeast Asia, we're having a lot of reservoir construction happening there as well. And this makes a lot of sense. Reservoirs provide many services for us, including water storage, hydroelectric energy, flood control, fishing, recreation, navigation. And these are all really wonderful, but they also have major impacts to the environment. They're very disruptive. And we can see that through their sediments, what they can deposit. Reservoirs are able to sequester and deposit about 26% of global river sediments, 12% of global river phosphorus, and 7.4% of global river nitrogen. And this is a really big deal. These are big numbers that they're able to sequester so much of what was traditionally moving downstream through the systems. So let's look at some reservoirs closer to home, specifically the ACF watershed. Now, whenever we talk about the ACF watershed, we always have to recognize the ACF water wars. This is the transboundary dispute between the states of Georgia, Alabama, and Florida for who has what rights to withdraw how much water from the Chattahoochee, Flint, and Apalachicola rivers, or watershed. And this issue gets even more complicated throughout drought years when there's less available water for people to consume. And what's also interesting is kind of the historic policies for the ACF watershed. Chattahoochee is a really interesting system. As you can see right over here, there's this large urban area, and that's the city of Atlanta, the surrounding metropolitan area. And in the 1960s, Atlanta had a huge population increase going from 1950 to 1970, with almost 500,000 people growing, moving to being born or joining this area. And there was minimal wastewater regulations at the time. A lot of phosphate detergents were being used. So these detergents and other materials to come to these wastewater treatment facilities, they didn't have as strong of regulations of how they had to be managed, and a lot of stuff got pumped into the Chattahoochee River. And then in the 1972, we had our Clean Water Act, which started creating some regulations for these, but it wasn't implemented right away. And then 1988, Atlanta had its peak loading period, so we know it kept getting a little bit more extreme over time. And then by 1993, Atlanta came under full compliance, and they really came under those full Clean Water Act regulations, and phosphate detergents were eliminated by then. So this kind of leaves the question of what happened to that 30-year pulse from the 1960s to the 1990s? And that's one thing we're going to be looking at. We're going to see what happened to all that phosphorus coming into the system, because phosphorus is a major important nutrient for watersheds. They can control a lot of activities. So not only what happened to it, but what are the drivers controlling where it was transported off to? And a similar extent, the same part as nitrogen, where did nitrogen in this whole process get transported to as well? If this is both are really required for large primary producer plant growth. So we went down to 6 reservoirs all along the Chattahoochee River downstream the metro Atlanta area. And we can see right here we have West Point Lake, Lake Harding, Goat Rock Lake, Lake Oliver, Lake Eufaula, and Lake Seminole. We're going to come back to these a lot, and you'll see WP1. This one represents the most upstream, and SE6 would represent the most downstream, the 6th reservoir, the first reservoir downstream. And we went to all these reservoirs and we collected sediment cores, or these sediment records of what deposited over time. We analyzed them for nutrients, isotopes, pigments, and heavy metals. So we went out to these systems, we collected them with using a gravity core, which we can see in this picture here, and an Icelandic piston core, which you can see in this picture is here as well. And we were able to capture these reservoir cores. And this is a perfect example of one. We have this light pale brown color here at the bottom. This would represent soils from before the reservoir was flooded. And so this would be pre-reservoir. And we have this dark brown color. And this represents more organic reservoir sediments that accumulated after reservoir construction. So we know that this point is the date that the reservoir was built. And this point was the date of which we collected it. And we could use those 2 points to be able to date the entire core profile. So what do we see? We're going to start with the oldest reservoir first, Goat Rock Lake. Goat Rock Lake was not what we were expecting when we first got it. It shows very minimal variation. We just talked about that 30-year phosphorus pulse, and this is phosphorus in milligrams to grams in the sediment. And this is not the concentrations we were expecting. We were expecting to see that big increase starting in the 1960s and coming down in the 1990s, and that's just not happening here. In fact, there's really low variation, which was odd to us, but we're going to come back to that one. And now we're going to go a little bit upstream to Lake Harding. So we're just there at Goat Rock Lake. Now we're here at Lake Harding. And we can see this general decrease over time. And that sort of, I guess, makes sense. Maybe Clean Water Act, and we're having decrease in better practices, and it's decreasing. But we really notice this big hump starting in the 1960s and kind of coming down in the 1970s. Well, we kind of talked about increase in 1960s, so that makes sense. But something must have happened to prevent it from keep going, because that does not make sense. Okay. So we're going to go to our next oldest reservoir, Lake Seminole. And what's important about Lake Seminole, this is the point where the Chattahoochee watershed and the Flint watershed meet each other. It's this terminal system right here. And it's also much more downstream compared to all of these other reservoirs. So it looks very different. That might be playing a big role to it. It's decreasing and increasing again. Still very odd. Let's keep going. We're going to come back to this one as well. We're going to go all the way back up to Lake Oliver. Lake Oliver is very interesting. It kind of follows Lake Harding in a lot of the ways right here, and then it kind of keeps following into Goat Rock Lake now. But it doesn't seem to have this hump nearly to the same degree. And this just may mean that the phosphorus from this area, whatever was causing this, just never made it to Lake Oliver. So that's kind of interesting. So something happened and Lake Harding switched from having this amount to being more like its local nearby ones. That's kind of odd that Goat Rock, this pink one, doesn't quite match. Okay, we're going to come back to that one too. This was a kind of a big disappointment for us. This one made no sense when we first collected it. It was the only one that was increasing in phosphorus concentration in the sediments. None of the other ones were really doing that to the same degree. It was this more downstream system, also less downstream than Lake Seminole, but still pretty far away from everything else. We thought maybe that was playing a role at the time. It was just a very complicated system. So let's actually bring the last reservoir and talk about all of them together for a minute. Okay, so here we go. Right off the bat, we can immediately see that these two humps kind of match each other in terms of magnitude and concentration. And right where West Point Lake was constructed in 1975 was generally the time when Lake Harding started decreasing. And this ends, this hump right here, right around 1993, which was when Atlanta's phosphorus management improvements occurred. So we've encapsulated the entire 30-year pulse within West Point Lake and Lake Harding. So we can already see that West Point Lake was constructed, cut off the sediment supply coming to Lake Harding, and now Lake Harding is acting more like its surrounding reservoirs of Lake Oliver and Goat Rock Lake, except for Goat Rock Lake is nothing like that. And so we went back through its parameters and we went back through its morphological traits. And we found that the Goat Rock Lake retention time, which is how much time water resides within the reservoir, was actually incredibly short. It has only a retention time of half a day. So in one single day, Goat Rock Lake will completely fill with water twice. So the flows are just moving so fast and water is moving through so quickly, there just isn't time for phosphorus to deposit in Goat Rock Lake. So that makes a lot of sense. It may act a lot more like these other two systems if it had a longer retention time, similar to these other two systems. Well, Lake Eufaula still wasn't receiving the same supply. And if we're assuming that this is cutting off the sediment supply, it would make a lot of sense. We have this city of Columbus right here, kind of replenishing some phosphorus coming into Lake Oliver. And there's just not as much supply reaching Lake Eufaula. So it just has a completely different signature. But for that all to make sense, we kind of have to prove that West Point Lake did cut off the sediment supply. So we went to USGS stream gauge data, and we are looking now at phosphorus in terms of milligrams per liter. We're looking at phosphorus in terms of water concentration of total phosphorus. And we can see the orange line is upstream, the gray line is downstream, and these are two stream gauges directly upstream and directly downstream of West Point Lake. And before West Point Lake was constructed, that black line, it's high variance for both upstream and downstream. And then after West Point Lake was constructed, the orange line keeps kind of fluctuating a lot, getting even higher concentrations in the water content, while the water content for the downstream stayed very regulated. It showed very little variation and was very much so controlled. So we can see that the presence of West Point Lake regulates how much phosphorus is actually making it to Lake Harding. So let's look about this with box plots instead of all these messy profiles. So we have this x-axis in terms of downstream, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 again. And we can see that if we were imagining this was the city of Atlanta, we can see that phosphorus is being controlled by geographic order. As we move further away from the primary nutrient source, the city of Atlanta, we have less and less phosphorus deposition. And we have this secondary role that we can very clearly see with Goat Rock Lake, that if you pass a minimum threshold of retention time, phosphorus isn't able to deposit anymore. Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about nitrogen. Nitrogen, we know, has an atmospheric component, meaning it's able to diffuse directly from the water back into the atmosphere and from the atmosphere back into the water. So the pathways of how it's going to move through the environment is going to be totally different from phosphorus, which is locked within the water and the sediments once it enters the system. And so we're looking at this PCA over here on the right, which is an exploratory analysis, which kind of lets us see how a relationship may appear in terms of deposition between these elements. We can see that phosphorus has a 90-degree ordination with nitrogen. And a 90-degree ordination represents a non-existent relationship or a minimal relationship. If it was directly opposite, as if nitrogen went directly in this direction, that would show a negative relationship. As one increases, the other one decreases. So that was ideal. We were hoping to see this. We went back to literature and we see that nitrogen deposition in reservoirs was postulated to be linked to retention time. And the mechanism here is if retention time within the reservoir increases, there is more opportunity for organic material to deposit into the sediments. So water is more still, more algal and primary producers can grow, and then deposition can happen over time, and then nitrogen increases. So we decided to look at 3 different pigment groups, diatoxanthin, alloxanthin, and canthaxanthin. We picked diatoxanthin because it represents healthy green algae, alloxanthin is a separate algal group, and canthaxanthin cyanobacterias. So we would expect to see maybe the different prevalences over time, but they all should have the same trend based on this mechanism. And we see that. We have this x-axis of retention time in terms of days, and then absorbance, which would represent how much pigment was there absorbing light when we analyze it with our HPLC. And we can see this strong positive relationship with all 3 pigments, saying, yes, as we increase in retention time, we have an increased amount of nitrogen deposition. So let's look at these watershed trends as a whole. When we look at phosphorus, we see over time, as we increase our distance away, looking at phosphorus, in terms of geographic order, is dominating when phosphorus deposition occurs within the basins. So moving further away from the far left, which would be city of Atlanta, going down, 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 less phosphorus deposition, as opposed to when we consider nitrogen in terms of retention time. Once again, these are our values in terms of days of retention for water. So 41, 43, 14, these longer retention times are increasing our amount of our amount of nitrogen deposition. Now, we were kind of expecting our N to P ratio to be this more sporadic combination of phosphorus and nitrogen not showing anything, but we were really, really surprised to see how it had 2 distinct clusters. We had the 4 most upstream systems and the 2 most downstream. And this was not what we were expecting at all. So we thought about it and we came up with 3 possible scenarios of what might be driving these distinct N to P clusters. One might be the presence of Hydrilla versalata, a noxious invasive macrophyte that is extremely prevalent in both Eufaula and Lake Seminole, the 2 most southern reservoirs. There is presence of Hydrilla in both Lake Harding and Lake Oliver, but not to the same degree. And this might act as a regulator as it absorbs or takes in nitrogen and phosphorus as it grows, and then as it quickly breaks down after it dies. Maybe this acts as a vector of pulling materials out, holding them, and then depositing them back into the sediments. That could be what's going on here. Another one possibly would be reservoir surface area. If we increase our reservoir surface area, that would allow more light to enter the reservoir system, allowing more biological growth potentially. And then this might lead to a greater amount of deposition, which could distinctly separate the 2. Another one might be population density. We saw a very strong negative relationship as we decreased population density. So Seminole and Eufaula having the least urban areas, more forested area, a little bit more agricultural area. We saw that they had a higher NDP ratio. Maybe this is somehow a land use signature in terms of population. And this was considering the entire watershed upstream from each of these reservoirs. So each one had a distinct population density that way. But yes, special thanks to Columbus Waterworks and Georgia Power for funding this project. And a big thank you, of course, to Auburn Paleoenvironmental Lab and the Jones Center at Itchaway for funding my personal research. Again, to my co-PIs, Dr. Matthew Waters and Dr. Stephen Gulladay, and my fellow graduate students for helping making this possible. And if anyone has any questions, I hope I can answer them later. Thank you so much.